My daughter-in-law slammed her glass down on the table and yelled at me during Christmas dinner. "Get out of here, and never come back." My son coldly pointed toward the door, driving his father out into the freezing rain. I didn't say a word. I just walked silently into the cold night. But they didn't know. Just 2 days later, when the official eviction order was enforced, everything crumbled little by little, just as things happen when the foundation was never meant for them in the first place. They were officially left empty-handed. Thank you for joining me today. Quick pause before we start. I'd love to know, have you ever had to draw a hard line with family? Just drop a yes or no in the comments. I read every one, and your perspective matters. Small disclaimer, some details here are fictionalized to emphasize the lesson, but the heart of the message is real. At 68, I had learned that invisibility in your own home is a special kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from being the man who bought the house but never earned a seat at the table. The Christmas lights blinked red and green against the front window of the Dilworth home, casting soft shadows across the hardwood floors I'd paid to refinish 3 years ago. In the kitchen, the scent of roasted turkey drifted through the archway, mingling with cinnamon and pine. Bing Crosby crooned from the sound system, another upgrade I'd funded but never asked for. The house was warm, the house was full, and I sat in the corner armchair with a cup of coffee gone cold watching. My son Kieran, 42, and sharp-suited in navy wool that probably cost more than my first car, stood at the doorway, guiding a couple I didn't recognize through what he called our home, never once glancing at the man who signed the deed 20 years ago. He gestured toward the vaulted ceiling with the easy confidence of ownership. "We bought this place years ago," Kieran said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Took a lot of work to get it exactly how we wanted." I heard the word "we." I tasted it bitter as the coffee on my tongue. The deed sat in a lockbox at Desmond Halifax's law office, my name alone in black ink across the title line. Kieran had been 22 when I purchased this house, fresh out of college, unemployed, and convinced the world owed him a soft landing. I'd provided one. For 2 decades, I'd kept providing. Priscilla, 39, and draped in jewelry I'd unknowingly paid for, stood near the staircase discussing renovations to a house whose title she'd never seen. Her laugh was bright and practiced, the kind that made guests feel included in something exclusive. She touched the banister, mahogany imported expensive, and smiled at a woman in a red dress I vaguely recognized from some charity function. "The upstairs renovation starts in March," Priscilla said, her voice carrying over the chatter. "New master bath, walk-in closets, the works. We're thinking about adding a nursery too, just in case." Just in case. As if children were a home improvement project you penciled into the spring schedule between new countertops and landscape design. I shifted in the armchair, leather hand-stitched. Another expense I couldn't quite remember approving, and felt the pill bottle press against my ribs through my coat pocket. The cough had started small 3 months ago. Dry, persistent, the kind that made people step back in crowded rooms. Dr. Brennan had handed me the prescription, without much ceremony, the same quarterly refill, the same reminder to avoid stress. The pills helped. Not much, but enough. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the amber bottle, and shook one capsule into my palm. Swallowed it dry. No water, no fuss. Across the room, Kieran laughed at something a guest said, head thrown back, teeth white and perfect thanks to the orthodontist I'd paid when he was 16. No one looked my way. No one ever did. The woman in the red dress leaned closer to Priscilla. "You two have built such a beautiful life here. Thank you," Priscilla said, her hand resting on the banister like a queen surveying her kingdom. "It's taken years, but we finally have everything exactly where we want it." I set the coffee cup on the side table. The ceramic made a soft click against the wood, a sound that disappeared into the music, and the laughter, and the perfect glittering lie of Christmas Eve. How long does it take for a man to become invisible in his own home? 20 years, as it turns out. Maybe less. Helen. My wife, gone 6 years now, taken by a stroke we had believed was just a warning, until 2 weeks later it wasn't. She used to sit in this chair with me on Christmas Eve, her hand warm in mine, and we'd watch Kieran open presents like a child, even when he was 30. She'd believed he'd grow into responsibility eventually. He just needs time, she'd say. He just needs to find his way. I'd given him time. I'd given him money. I'd given him this house, this life, this illusion of self-made success. And somewhere in the transaction, I'd stopped being a father and become a checkbook. Priscilla's voice floated from the hallway again. We're so grateful for everything we have. Truly blessed. Blessed, I almost laughed. Almost. The guests began to drift toward the dining room, where the table was set with china Helen and I had received as a wedding gift 43 years ago. White porcelain with gold trim, delicate enough to chip if you looked at it wrong. Kieran had wanted to replace it last year, something modern, something that matched Priscilla's aesthetic. I'd said no. It was the only time I'd said no in a decade. I watched them file past these strangers in my home and felt the weight of every Christmas before this one. Every year I'd sat in this chair. Every year I'd smiled and nodded and played the role of the quiet patriarch, grateful to be included in the life I'd built for someone else. I had spent 2 decades buying peace. Tonight I would stop paying. The last guest disappeared into the dining room. Kieran lingered at the archway, checking his phone, probably confirming reservations for some New Year's trip I'd eventually be billed for. Priscilla adjusted a garland on the mantel, her rings catching the light from the Christmas tree. Neither of them looked at me. I picked up the coffee cup again, even though it was cold. Held it just to have something to do with my hands. Through the window, the lights blinked on and off, red, then green, then red, a rhythm I'd watched for 20 Decembers. I heard that sentence. Priscilla's voice in my head, planning renovations, dreaming of nurseries, mapping out a future in a house she thought belonged to her. And I knew tonight was the last night I would ever sit in this chair, not because I was dying. Dr. Brennan had given me time more than I needed, but because I'd made a decision 3 weeks ago, sitting in Desmond Halifax's office, listening to him explain what was possible if I was willing to do what was necessary. I was willing. I set the coffee cup down on the side table, ceramic against wood, a small sound lost in the laughter. Priscilla's voice drifted from the hallway, spring renovations, new plans, their future. I looked at the Christmas lights blinking against the window one more time. There would be no spring. Not here. Not for them. The silence after the guests left was heavier than any conversation we'd had in years. The last couple had said their goodbyes at the door, effusive thanks promises to get together soon, the usual Christmas script. Kieran had waved from the porch, his smile holding, until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he'd closed the door, and the warmth had drained from the house like air from a punctured tire. The dining room table was set with Helen's china, each plate positioned exactly as she used to arrange them. White porcelain gleamed in the candlelight. Steam rose from the carved turkey at the center, surrounded by roasted vegetables and a basket of rolls I knew Priscilla hadn't baked herself. I took my seat at the far end, the position I'd occupied for 20 years, close enough to be included, but distant enough to be ignored. Kieran sat at the head of the table. My seat technically, but I'd stopped arguing about that a decade ago. Priscilla settled across from me, her rings catching the light, as she unfolded her napkin with practiced precision. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It never did when the guests were gone. "So," she said, her voice bright and sharp, "quite a turnout tonight." I nodded, picked up my fork, said nothing. "You were quiet," she continued, reaching for the wine bottle. "But then you usually are." Kieran carved the turkey with quick, efficient strokes. "Dad's always been more of a listener," he said, not looking up. "Right, Dad. Something like that," I said. Priscilla poured herself a full glass of wine, a Cabernet I recognized from the cellar, probably $200 a bottle. She took a long sip and studied me over the rim. "You know what your problem is, Dad," she said, and I heard the shift in her tone. Softer now, almost concerned. The way a nurse might speak to a patient who'd forgotten to take their medication. "You're stuck in the past. You don't understand how the world works anymore." I set my fork down. "Is that right?" "It's not a criticism," she said, leaning forward. "It's just generational. Things move faster now. Business technology expectations. Kieran and I were navigating a different landscape than you did." "Different," I repeated. "More complex," Kieran added, finally looking up. "More competitive. You built your wealth in a simpler time. I'd built my wealth running a logistics company for 35 years, negotiating contracts and managing supply chains and working weekends while Helen raised our son alone." Simpler seemed like the wrong word, but I didn't correct him. Priscilla's smile widened. Each word she'd spoken so far had been a test, I realized. A small provocation to see if I'd rise to it. I'd passed by staying silent, so she'd escalate. "The thing is," she continued, her voice still sweet, still concerned, "at your age, it might be better to just let go. Let the people who understand the modern world make the decisions." "Let go," I said. "Exactly." She reached for a roll, buttered it slowly. "Enjoy your retirement. Stop worrying about things that don't concern you anymore." I watched her hands, delicate manicured, adorned with diamonds I'd indirectly purchased through deposits into the family account Kieran controlled. The account I still technically owned, but had stopped monitoring years ago because every time I asked about it, I was told I didn't understand modern finance. "Actually," I said, my voice quiet and even, "I did want to ask about something." Kieran's knife paused mid-slice. Priscilla's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I noticed a withdrawal from the family account last month," I continued. $8,000. Can you help me understand what that was for?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. Priscilla set her roll down, slowly, deliberately. Her jaw tightened. "Are you serious right now?" she said. "I'm just asking," I said. "You're just asking." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "On Christmas Eve, at dinner, you're interrogating us about money." "I'm not interrogating." "Yes, you are." She stood her chair, scraping against the hardwood. "You sit there in your little corner all night, judging us, keeping track like some kind of accountant. And then you have the audacity to question how we spend our money." "It's not your—" I started, but I didn't finish. Her fury erupted before I could even process her movement. She slammed her glass down on the table, the wine splashing across the white linen, as she stood pointing a trembling, manicured finger inches from my face. The room went dead silent. My ears rang with the sheer venom of her voice. "Don't you ever," she hissed, her eyes wild with rage, "question me again." I turned my head back, slowly looked at her. Her face was flushed, eyes bright with fury or wine or both. Kieran had risen from his seat, but he wasn't reaching for his wife. He was staring at me. "Dad," he said, and his voice was cold, controlled. "I think you need to leave." I touched my cheek, felt the heat, the sting. I looked at my son. "Kieran, get out," he said, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my house and don't ever come back." What does a man say when thrown out of a house he bought with his own money? Nothing, as it turns out. I stood. The chair didn't scrape. I moved too carefully for that. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. I felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of 20 years of small humiliations. But I also felt something else, clarity. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Maybe the moment I'd engineered by asking that one specific question about $8,000 I already knew had been spent on a vacation I hadn't been invited on. I walked to the door, picked up my coat from the hook beside it slowly, without hurry, without a single word. Behind me, the candles still flickered on the dinner table. Priscilla's breathing had steadied. Kieran stood frozen, his hand still pointing toward the exit, like a statue of judgment. I opened the door. The December rain hit my face cold and clean. I stepped outside onto the porch I'd paid to rebuild 5 years ago. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and through the window I could still see the Christmas lights blinking the same rhythm I had watched from inside for 20 years, now seen from the outside for the first time. Green then red. I walked down the steps and didn't look back. For 10 minutes I sat in the car and did nothing at all, just listened to the rain and watched the house glow warm against the December night. I'd parked 3 houses down far enough that they wouldn't see me through the window if they looked close enough that I could still make out the Christmas lights blinking through the rain-streaked windshield. Red, then green. Green, then red. The same pattern I'd watched from inside for 20 years. My chest still burned from the raw disrespect that had just unfolded. I leaned my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes. The echo of her screaming, the pure entitlement in her voice, the heavy silence that followed, remained sharp and clear in my mind. Inside that house, Kieran and Priscilla were probably sitting at the table finishing the dinner I'd been ordered to leave. Maybe they were relieved. Maybe they were already planning how to use the master bedroom I'd been occupying, the one with the ensuite bath, and the walk-in closet Helen had designed before she died. I reached for my phone. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. I scrolled to a name I'd called exactly 7 times in the past month, always after 9 p.m., always when I was alone. I pressed dial. He answered on the second ring. Otis. Desmond Halifax said, his voice steady and calm. 57 and practicing law for 3 decades, Desmond had prepared these documents years ago, waiting for the night I would finally call and say the word that mattered now. I'm out, I said. In the car, Desmond. A pause. I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man who'd been expecting this call, but still needed a moment to acknowledge it had finally come. I knew you'd call tonight, he said. Are you ready? I've been ready for 30 days, I said. The court issued the writ of possession back in November, Desmond confirmed. Kieran signed for the paperwork himself, certified mail delivery confirmed November 24th. The standard occupancy grace period has long expired. December 26th is simply the first working day the sheriff's office scheduled enforcement. They don't execute evictions on the holiday itself. Tonight the clock ran out. They have no legal leg to stand on. Kieran had signed the court summons weeks ago, but arrogance made him ignore it. I'd seen the delivery confirmation. He'd opened an envelope with a return address from a law firm, read that he had 30 days to leave the house, and either assumed it was a mistake or simply ignored it. He'd never called, never asked. Never once considered that the house he called his own might actually belong to someone else. Execute it, I said. The sheriff's eviction order is already filed, Desmond replied. Since the 30 days expired on Christmas Eve, the county scheduled the removal for the very first working dawn right after the holiday, December 26th. They have exactly 48 hours of false peace left. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of it, not guilt exactly, but a kind of finality. This was the moment I'd chosen. The date I'd circled when I signed those papers in Desmond's office, knowing that if my son threw me out on Christmas Eve, the law would return the favor the moment the holiday ended. Where are you going tonight? Desmond asked. Downtown hotel, I said. The Marriott on Trade Street. Good. Stay there. Don't answer calls from Kieran or Priscilla. If they reach out, refer them to me. They won't call, I said. They think I'm the one who's been evicted. Desmond was quiet for a moment. Then, how long does it take to prepare for the night you lose your family? 30 days, apparently. Maybe a lifetime. He didn't wait for me to respond. I'll be available all night if you need me. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. to go over the next steps. Thank you, Desmond. Merry Christmas, Otis. He hung up. I sat in silence, phone still warm in my hand. Through the windshield, the house glowed. Warm light spilled from the windows. Somewhere inside, Kieran was living a life he thought he'd earned. I opened my messages and typed a short text to the one person who'd known this was coming. My daughter, Serafina, 36, and practicing estate law 3 states away, had always been the one who listened, the one who noticed when silence meant something was breaking. When I'd first told her about the plan, she hadn't argued, hadn't tried to talk me out of it. She'd just said, "Tell me when." I typed, "It happened, leaving now." I watched the 3 dots appear immediately. She was awake, waiting. Her reply came in seconds. "I'm on my way. Don't answer their calls." Then another, "I'll be there by morning. Love you, Dad." I stared at the screen. My daughter was ready. My son never saw it coming. One child had been listening. The other had never heard a word. I set the phone in the cup holder and gripped the steering wheel. My hands didn't shake. My breath came steady and even. The rain drummed on the roof, a rhythm that felt almost like applause. I thought about Helen. Wondered what she'd say if she could see me now sitting in a car on Christmas Eve, about to drive away from the son we'd raised together. She'd always believed Kieran would grow up. Always believed he just needed more time, more patience, more grace. 6 years without her voice in the house, and I had kept every promise she'd asked me to keep. Time for Kieran. Patience. Grace. He'd used all 3 to build a life on my back and call it his own. I turned the key. The engine purred to life. I checked the mirrors, signaled even though there was no one behind me, and pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the Christmas lights grew smaller against the rain, then disappeared as I turned the corner. I never looked back. The downtown hotel was 12 minutes away. Serafina's flight would land in 8 hours. And by sunrise, Kieran would discover what 30 days of silence had built: a legal wall he couldn't climb, a debt he couldn't pay, and a father who'd finally stopped waiting for him to notice. I wasn't there when the sheriff knocked on their door at 7:30 on the morning of December 26th, but I knew exactly what was happening. I'd checked into the Marriott on Trade Street just after 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, taken the elevator to the 3rd floor, and slept better than I had in months. I spent December 25th in quiet isolation, and when I woke at 6:15 on December 26th, I made coffee in the room's small pot and sat by the window watching the sun rise over downtown Charlotte. At 7:30, I looked at my watch and pictured the scene unfolding 3 miles away. The knock would be firm, but not aggressive. Professional. Sheriff Thomas Hargrove, 48, and experienced enough to recognize the look of people who genuinely didn't see it coming, would be holding a clipboard with official documents. Behind him, a deputy, maybe 2. Kieran would answer the door in his bathrobe, Egyptian cotton navy blue, monogrammed with initials I'd paid to have embroidered. He'd be holding a coffee mug, still half asleep, annoyed at being woken early. Sheriff Hargrove would hand him the paperwork without flinching. "Sir, the court-ordered eviction judgment was signed by the judge last month. The absolute deadline to vacate passed at midnight. This is a lawful enforcement of a writ of possession." I could see Kieran's face in my mind, the confusion giving way to anger, then to something approaching fear. He'd scan the document, eyes catching on words like eviction and vacate and legal property owner. "I never received this," Kieran would say. "This is a mistake. I would have seen certified mail, sir." The sheriff would pull out a second page. "Delivery confirmation signed November 25th by Priscilla Langley." And there it would be, Priscilla's looping signature, proof that the envelope had arrived, been opened, and somehow dismissed as something that didn't require her husband's attention. Priscilla would appear at the door, then pulling a silk robe tight around her waist, her hair still perfect despite the early hour. She'd look at the sheriff, then at the paper in Kieran's hand, and her face would go pale. "I thought it was junk mail," she'd say, her voice thin. "I didn't think," but thinking had never been the problem. The problem was that they'd stopped believing consequences applied to them. The sheriff would explain the timeline calmly. 30 days from November 24th meant the deadline expired at midnight on December 24th. They had until noon today to remove their belongings. After that, anything remaining would be considered abandoned property. Kieran would try to argue. He'd demand to see ownership documents. He'd threaten lawyers and lawsuits and complaints to the mayor. And Sheriff Hargrove would listen with the patience of a man who'd heard it all before and knew that volume didn't change the law. Then the tow truck would arrive. I'd arranged that part specifically. 7:45 a.m. The SUV in the driveway, a Lexus purchased with funds from the family account I controlled, was registered under my name. Legally mine. Legally repossessed. Priscilla would see it first. She'd run outside in her nightgown, bare feet on cold concrete, screaming at the driver to stop. "Stop! You can't take that! We need that car!" But the driver would already have the vehicle hooked up, paperwork in hand, unmoved by her tears or her fury. The Christmas lights still blinked on the porch, red, green, gold, cheerful as a smile on a corpse. Kieran would pull out his wallet, hands shaking, and offer his credit card for emergency storage fees. The sheriff would shake his head. This wasn't a negotiation. But Kieran would try anyway, pulling out his phone to call for a moving truck, a storage unit, anything. The card would decline. He'd try again. Same result. "What? That's impossible. Run it again." Priscilla would try hers. Also declined. I'd notified the bank at 8 p.m. the night before, sitting in my hotel room with my laptop open, methodically freezing the primary funding lines and removing my name as the financial guarantor from their authorized cards. Every secondary account they held was tied to my corporate backing. With one signature, I severed the safety net, rendering their plastic useless. 20 years of comfort can disappear in 7 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Kieran would stand in the driveway in his bathrobe, Christmas morning cold, seeping through the thin fabric, and finally understand that the life he'd been living wasn't his. It was mine. And I'd just taken it back. He'd pull out his phone one more time, not to call a lawyer or a bank, to call me. I set my coffee cup down on the hotel room desk and looked at my phone lying face up on the nightstand. 7:52 a.m., right on schedule. It started vibrating. Kieran's name lit up the screen. I watched it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Pictured him standing in that driveway watching the tow truck pull away with his vehicle, the sheriff waiting patiently for him to accept reality, Priscilla crying in the doorway. The phone kept ringing. I didn't move. 4 rings, 5. In my mind, I could hear his voice. "Dad. Dad, pick up, please." The same voice that had said 24 hours ago, "Get out of my house and don't ever come back." 6 rings, 7. My voicemail picked up. I'd recorded the message years ago, back when I still believed my calm, measured tone conveyed authority rather than invisibility. "You've reached Otis Langley. Leave a message." The phone stopped vibrating. 30 seconds later, it started again. I walked to the window and looked out at the city waking up to Christmas morning. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what it felt like to lose everything in a single conversation. To stand in a home that wasn't his and realize he'd never actually earned a single thing he thought he owned. The phone rang a 3rd time. I picked up my coffee, took a sip, and let it go to voicemail again. Kieran's hand would be shaking by now. His voice, when he finally left a message, would be breaking. But I wouldn't listen to it. Not today. Maybe not ever. The phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Then 10 seconds later, it started ringing again. 4 calls. 5. 6. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and went to take a shower. By noon on December 26th, my phone had vibrated 11 times, and I had answered exactly 0 calls. I'd showered, dressed, and ordered room service scrambled eggs and toast that arrived on a tray with a small pot of coffee that tasted better than anything I'd drunk in the Dilworth house in years. I sat by the window overlooking Trade Street, watching the post-Christmas traffic crawl through downtown Charlotte, and let my phone perform its silent dance on the nightstand. 7 calls from Kieran, 4 from Priscilla, each one more desperate than the last. I didn't need to listen to the voicemails to know what they said. I could picture Kieran's progression. The first call would have been angry, demanding an explanation. The second, confused. By the fifth, his voice would be cracking, that entitled fury giving way to something closer to panic. Priscilla's calls would follow a similar arc, though hers would maintain a veneer of civility longer. She'd been trained to smile through disaster. I picked up my coffee and took a sip. Still hot. Still bitter in the way good coffee should be. The phone buzzed again. Kieran, call number 8. I watched it ring and did nothing. The power I'd learned was not in what you said, but in what you refused to say. Silence had a weight that words could never carry. Every unanswered call was a message in itself. I know what you did. I know who you are. And I am done. The voicemail notification appeared. I set my coffee down and picked up the folded newspaper the hotel had delivered with breakfast. The front page was full of Christmas Day stories, charity drives, family gatherings, a house fire in East Charlotte that displaced 12 people. I read every article and didn't think about my phone once. How many times does a man need to call before he realizes silence is also an answer? 11 apparently, maybe 12. At 10:47, the phone rang again. I glanced at the screen expecting Kieran's name. Instead, Linda Mercer. My older sister, 71, and perpetually convinced she knew what was best for everyone, had always defended Kieran the way older siblings defend younger ones reflexively, without examination. She'd been at Thanksgiving 3 years ago when I'd quietly mentioned that Kieran had asked for another loan. He's building something, Otis, she'd said, her voice firm with certainty. You have to invest in your children. I'd invested. For 20 years I'd invested, and the return had been absolute humiliation at their table and an eviction from my own home. I picked up the phone. Linda, I said. Otis, what are you doing? Her voice was sharp-clipped. No greeting, no preamble. That boy is calling everyone in the family. He's desperate. Is he? Don't play games with me. He says you threw him out of his house. On Christmas. What kind of father? Linda. I said, my voice calm and even. I'm going to send you something. Listen to it. Then decide if you want to call me back. She started to argue, but I hung up. I opened my messages, scrolled to the audio file I'd saved 14 months ago. The one I'd recorded during a phone call I'd known even then would matter someday, and sent it to her number. 1 minute and 37 seconds. That was all it took. I set the phone down and waited. On the recording, my voice was calm. Kieran, I can't keep covering these expenses. The credit card bills alone are... And Kieran's voice sharp and cutting. I mean it, Dad. Either help me or we're done. You won't hear from me again. Your choice. Loan me the $15,000 or lose your son. What's it going to be? There was a pause. Then my voice again, quiet and defeated. I'll transfer it tomorrow. Good, Kieran had said. And Dad, don't bring this up at Thanksgiving. Mom wouldn't want the family to know you're being difficult. Mom had been dead for 3 years when he said that. I'd transferred the money the next morning. $15,000 into an account he'd drained within 2 weeks. He'd never mentioned it again, never acknowledged the ultimatum, never considered that weaponizing my love for him might be something I'd remember. But I remembered. And I'd kept the recording. I answered Linda's call because she had never asked me for money. That made all the difference. My phone stayed silent for the next hour. Linda didn't call back. I pictured her sitting in her living room in Raleigh, the audio file playing on repeat, finally understanding that the grandson she'd defended had been holding his father hostage for years. At 11:45, my phone rang again. This time, Desmond Halifax. I answered on the first ring. Otis, he said, and I heard the undertone I recognized as satisfaction. Your daughter just arrived at my office. I straightened in my chair. Serafina's there. She brought documentation I think you'll want to see. Desmond continued. She's been thorough, Otis. Very thorough. I set my coffee cup down, the ceramic clicking against the saucer. What did she find? Come to the office, Desmond said. You'll want to see this in person. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and stood reaching for my coat draped over the desk chair. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. But underneath the composure was something else: anticipation. Serafina had flown in from 3 states away on Christmas Eve. She'd texted me, "I'm on my way," with no questions, no hesitation, no surprise. Because she'd known this moment was coming. And now she was sitting in Desmond's office with documents she'd gathered in secret. Evidence. Proof. Whatever came next wouldn't just be my word against Kieran's. It would be facts, timestamps, paper trails that couldn't be argued away with charm or deflection. My daughter had been listening. My daughter had been working. I pulled on my coat and checked the room one last time. The phone lay on the nightstand screen, dark and silent. No new calls. Kieran had either given up or was regrouping. It didn't matter. I picked up the phone, slid it into my pocket, and walked to the door. Whatever Serafina had found was important enough for Desmond to insist I come in person. And whatever it would be the next piece in a plan I'd been building for longer than my son had ever suspected. I stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind me with a soft click. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone had started vibrating again. Kieran. Call number 12. I didn't even glance at the screen. Serafina was sitting at Desmond's conference table when I walked in, and the folder in front of her was thicker than I'd expected. Desmond's office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on South Tryon Street. Polished mahogany floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs that didn't creak. My daughter looked small in that room, but her posture was straight and her eyes were clear. She stood when I entered. We'd never been the hugging type. "Dad," she said. "Serafina." Desmond gestured to the chair across from her. I sat. The folder lay between us like evidence at a trial. "I've been watching the accounts for 4 months," Serafina said. She slid the folder across the table. "She's been siphoning since July." I opened it. The first page was a bank statement, Kieran and Priscilla's joint checking account, the one I'd set up 7 years ago as a wedding gift. Highlighted in yellow, a transfer. July 12th. $2,300. Memo line blank. I turned the page. Another transfer. July 19th. 1,800. August 3rd. 3,200. The pattern was unmistakable. Small enough not to trigger alerts. Frequent enough to add up. I flipped through 6 months of statements and stopped at the final page where Serafina had written, "Total transferred $47,000. $47,000, I said. Desmond leaned forward. "All transferred to an account Kieran doesn't know exists. Priscilla's maiden name, Hastings. Opened in June, 3 weeks before the first transfer." I looked at my daughter. She met my gaze without flinching. "She's been preparing to leave him," Serafina said. "While they were planning to throw you out, she was planning to throw him out. A betrayal within a betrayal." I should have felt vindication, but all I felt was tired. "Does he know?" I asked. "Not yet," Desmond said. "The statements go to a P.O. box under her maiden name. Kieran has no access, no visibility, no idea it exists." I closed the folder. One child had been watching for months. The other had never looked up long enough to see anything at all. "There's something else," Serafina said, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I talked to Kieran 2 days ago. He mentioned an anonymous investment fund that's been pursuing his company. He seemed genuinely worried." I said nothing. "He said they'd made 3 offers in the past year. The most recent was 2 weeks ago, $8.7 million for full acquisition." Desmond's smile was so slight I almost missed it. Serafina saw it. She looked from him to me, waiting. "Dad," she said slowly, "is there something else I should know?" I met her gaze. "Did he?" The silence stretched. Serafina studied my face the way she used to study law school textbooks, looking for the detail that would unlock the whole case. "But not today." Desmond cleared his throat. "The question is what you want to do with this. Priscilla's transfers are technically legal, but the pattern suggests intent to defraud. She's been lying about expenses," Serafina added, pulling out another sheet. 3 times in 4 months, Kieran told me they were short on the mortgage. Asked if I could loan them money. I didn't. But the records show they weren't short. Priscilla was redirecting payments into her escape fund. I looked at the numbers again. $47,000. 6 months of small, deliberate thefts. My son's wife quietly dismantling their life while humiliating his father for daring to ask a question. His father for daring to ask a question. How many layers of betrayal can exist in a single family before it stops being a family entirely? When do you want to meet them? Desmond asked. I turned to the window. 14 floors below, Charlotte moved through its afternoon cars on Tryon Street. People hurrying between buildings, everyone certain tomorrow would look like today. Kieran and Priscilla had that certainty 3 days ago. Now they had nothing but panic and unanswered calls. I could meet them today, lay out the evidence, watch them scramble. But there was value in waiting, in letting the fear deepen. 2 days from now, I said, give them time to feel it. Desmond nodded, pulling out his calendar. December 29th. Where? Somewhere public, neutral. I paused. Maple Grove Cafe, 10 in the morning. I'll send the notice, Desmond said. Serafina was still watching me. Will you tell him about Priscilla's account? Eventually, I said. And the investment fund. I stood straightening my coat. One revelation at a time. Serafina closed the folder, her fingers resting on the cover. She'd found Priscilla's secret account, traced the transfers, built a case that would stand up in court. But she didn't yet know about the patents I'd quietly secured 15 years ago. The trust structures I'd built when Kieran first started his company, using my capital and connections while believing he'd done it alone. The blind ownership that meant every dollar he thought he'd earned had my fingerprints on it. The architecture I'd spent 20 years building, invisible to everyone except Desmond and the accountants who knew better than to ask. December 29th would reveal more than she expected. But first, Kieran and Priscilla would have 2 more days to discover what life without safety nets felt like. I picked up the folder. Thank you, Serafina. This is good work. She nodded, but didn't smile. Dad, when this is over, I said gently, I'll tell you everything. I promise. I left with the folder under my arm and didn't look back. 72 hours can split a life in two, one half. Still believing rescue will come, the other half learning what peace without obligation feels like. I spent those days in my hotel room reading books I'd bought years ago but never opened. 8 meals I ordered without consulting anyone. Slept through the night without waking to check my phone. The quiet was extraordinary, not the absence of sound, but the absence of demands. 3 miles away, Kieran and Priscilla were learning a different kind of quiet. I didn't need to see them to know what those 72 hours looked like. Serafina texted me updates, brief, clinical, the observations of an attorney documenting a case. They'd found a weekly rental in East Charlotte, the kind of place that took cash and didn't ask questions. On December 27th, they'd gone to a grocery store and stood in the aisle for 20 minutes, trying to decide what $43 could buy the cost of basics that used to appear in their kitchen, without thought, without thanks, without any understanding of where it all came from. Serafina sent me a photo she'd taken from across the parking lot, Kieran holding a receipt, Priscilla staring at a deactivated credit card like it had personally betrayed her. They'd tried to log into their bank accounts that afternoon. Neither of them knew the passwords. I'd always handled the finances, set up the automatic transfers, paid the bills, managed the investments they believed they'd earned. They'd never actually managed money because someone else always did. The realization must have come slowly, then all at once. Priscilla's card declined at a gas station on the 28th, a public humiliation, the clerk's patient voice asking if she had another form of payment. Kieran counting change for bus fare, the coins slipping through fingers that had never had to calculate the cost of getting somewhere. Small indignities accumulating into the larger truth they'd been living a life someone else funded, and now that someone had walked away, a safety net you never see becomes invisible. When it's gone, you don't fall gradually, you drop all at once. I sat in my hotel room on the evening of December 28th, reading a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, a man who'd known something about rebuilding after loss, when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. They stopped at my door. I set the book down and walked quietly to the peephole. Kieran stood in the hallway, unshaven and exhausted, his hand raised to knock. He wore the same clothes I'd seen him in at Christmas dinner, wrinkled now, and carrying the weight of 3 days without laundry. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was tight. He knocked. The sound echoed in my small room, sharp, desperate, the knock of someone who'd run out of options. "Dad," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "I know you're in there. Please." I stood at the peephole and watched him. 10 seconds. 20. His hand dropped to his side, then rose again. "We need to talk," he said. I can't." His voice cracked. "Please just open the door." 20 years I opened every door. 20 years I answered every call, met every demand, provided every safety net he'd learned to expect without asking. 20 years of teaching him that boundaries were negotiable if he pushed hard enough. Tonight I chose to keep one closed. I turned around, walked back to my chair, and picked up my book. Behind me, Kieran knocked again, harder this time. "I don't understand what I did," he said, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Just tell me what I did wrong." I turned the page and kept reading. The footsteps of a man who'd led a cavalry charge up San Juan Hill, who'd rebuilt himself after his wife died, who'd understood that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their own choices. Kieran knocked a third time, then silence. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, growing fainter with each step until the elevator chimed and he was gone. The room settled back into its extraordinary quiet. I read another chapter, made a cup of tea from the small pot the hotel provided, stood at the window watching Charlotte's lights blink on as evening deepened into night. Then I set the book down and opened my wallet. The photograph was small and creased from years of carrying, the corners soft from being touched. Helen at 43, standing at the edge of the sequoia grove on the trip we'd taken the summer before everything changed, laughing at something outside the frame. I couldn't remember what had made her laugh that day, but I remembered the sound of it, bright and unguarded, the laugh of someone who'd found joy in small things. I held the photo longer than usual tonight, studying her face in the lamplight. She'd always drawn a line between provision and protection, between giving a man a life and teaching him to build one. The greatest gift, she used to say, was the chance to stand on your own, even if it meant falling first. I'd argued with her about it when Kieran was young, convinced that provision equaled protection, that my job as a father was to smooth every rough edge from his path. She'd been right. She'd always been right. Helen had been gone 6 years, but her voice was clearer tonight than it had been in months. "You were right," I said aloud to the photographer. "You were always right." The room didn't answer, but I felt something shift anyway, a weight lifting, a clarity settling. Tomorrow I'd show Kieran everything. Tomorrow he'd see what I'd built, what he'd thrown away, what he'd never actually had. The folder of documents waiting on Desmond's desk would reveal the architecture of a life he'd believed was his own. But tonight, I just held Helen's photograph and let myself remember what it felt like to be married to someone who'd loved me enough to tell me hard truths. "I wish you were here to see this," I said softly. "But maybe you already do." I slid the photo back into my wallet and glanced at the calendar on the bedside table. December 29th. Tomorrow circled in the pen. The cafe meeting. The folder of documents. The moment Kieran would discover not just what he'd lost, but what he'd never actually had. But tonight, one more conversation needed to happen first. My phone buzzed. Serafina's name lit up the screen. I picked it up. Serafina knocked on my hotel room door at 8:30 that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the look of someone who'd come to ask questions that had no easy answers. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which we both knew was a lie. Her rental car was parked 3 blocks away. She'd driven from her temporary apartment across town specifically to have this conversation. I let her in. She handed me one of the cups, black, no sugar, the way I'd been drinking it for 40 years, and settled into the chair by the window. The city lights spread out below us, Charlotte glittering in the December cold. She studied my face in the soft lamplight, and I saw Helen in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. "Do you regret it, Dad?" she asked. No preamble, no easing into it. Any of it. I took a sip of the coffee. It was good, better than the hotel pot, which meant she'd stopped at the cafe on Trade Street, the one that roasted their own beans. A small kindness wrapped in a hard question. The legalities, I asked. The strategy? No. She shook her head. The fundamental choice. To stop carrying him. I set the cup down on the desk and looked out at the city. Somewhere in those lights, Kieran was sitting in a rental apartment, trying to figure out how to survive on $43. Somewhere Priscilla was realizing her carefully hidden account wouldn't save her from the collapse of everything she'd built on someone else's foundation. "I regret how long it took me to see clearly," I said finally. "But no, I don't regret finally opening my eyes." Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then, "Even knowing what tomorrow will do to him, especially knowing that." She nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. She sipped her coffee and stared out at the lights, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at this city opportunity, or just the place where her family had broken apart on Christmas Eve. "Mom tried to tell you," she said softly, "about Kieran, for years." I turned to look at her. "She did. But you didn't listen." I wasn't ready to hear it. I stood and walked to the desk, picking up the small framed photograph I'd been carrying in my wallet for 6 years. Helen at 43, standing in the garden, behind our first house, laughing at something I could no longer remember. The photo was faded now, the corners soft from being touched, but her face was as clear as it had been the day I took it. "Your mother used to say—" I paused, finding the words. "Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling." Serafina's eyes glistened. "I remember. She said it about Kieran when he was 25, and asking for his third loan in 2 years. She said it again when he was 30 and I co-signed for the house. Every time I opened my wallet, she'd give me this look, not angry, just sad. Like she was watching me build a cage and call it protection." "What did you say to her that she didn't understand?" "That providing for your children was what fathers did." I set the photo down gently on the desk. She told me there was a difference between providing and enabling. I told her she was being too hard on him. Serafina reached across and touched the photo frame, her fingers tracing the edge. "She tried to tell you for years, didn't she?" "She did. I wasn't ready to hear it. By the time I was, she was gone." The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic from the street below. Some people leave us, but never stop teaching. Helen had been gone 6 years, but her voice was the clearest thing in the room tonight. "Do you think she'd approve?" Serafina asked. "Of what you're doing?" I thought about that. About Helen watching me sign check after check, set up account after account, smooth over every consequence Kieran should have faced on his own. About the last conversation we'd had before the stroke took her sitting in the hospital while she recovered from what the doctors said was a minor episode, her hand weak in mine but her voice still strong. "Stop saving him," she'd said. "You're not helping. You're just teaching him he doesn't have to save himself." 2 weeks later, she was gone. "Yes," I said. "I think she'd approve." Serafina nodded and set down her coffee cup. The steam had stopped rising from it, the heat bleeding away into the cool hotel air. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part grief, part understanding, part something else. "Do you think he'll change, Dad?" she asked. After tomorrow, I watched the steam rise from my own cup, curling in the lamplight, like smoke from a candle just blown out. When does a father's responsibility to save his son end, and the son's responsibility to save himself begin. I'd spent 20 years believing the answer was never. Helen had known better. I don't know, I said, finally meeting my daughter's eyes with the honesty that had taken me 68 years to learn. But that is no longer my responsibility. The words hung in the air between us, not cruel, not cold, just true. Serafina studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She understood. Maybe she'd understood before I did. "What will you say to him?" she asked. "Tomorrow at the cafe, when you hand him the folder." I looked at the documents stacked on the desk. Deed tax records, tuition receipts, medical expenses, the trust documents, the will. 20 years of evidence that the life Kieran thought he'd built had been constructed on a foundation I'd poured in secret. Every brick I'd paid for, every beam I'd reinforced, every wall I'd shored up when it started to crack. Tomorrow he'd see those blueprints. Tomorrow he'd understand what he'd actually owned. Nothing. Nothing, I said. "I'll let the papers talk." Serafina stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Get some sleep, Dad. Tomorrow is going to be hard." I looked at the folder on the desk, evidence of 20 years reduced to paper and signatures and canceled checks. Hard wasn't the word for it. Tomorrow would be the ending of a story, 20 years in the writing. And it would begin at 10 o'clock in a cafe that smelled of cinnamon and truth. The Maple Grove Cafe smelled like cinnamon and coffee when Serafina and I walked through the door at 9:45, 15 minutes before my son was scheduled to arrive. We chose a table near the window overlooking the street. Serafina helped me spread the folders across the polished wood surface, 7 stacks organized chronologically, each one representing a truth Kieran had never bothered to learn. The morning light came through the glass at an angle, catching the edges of the documents inside. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. Kieran and Priscilla stepped inside, and 5 days after Christmas Eve, they looked profoundly different. His face was unshaven stubble, darkening a jaw I'd last seen smooth and confident. Her clothes were wrinkled, the same cashmere sweater she'd worn to the eviction, now carrying the weight of 3 days without proper laundry. They moved with the careful posture of people who'd learned to count every step, every dollar, every decision. Kieran's eyes found mine across the cafe. He straightened his shoulders, composed his expression, and walked to our table like a man prepared to negotiate terms. He didn't understand yet that negotiations had ended the night he pointed at the door and said those words. They sat. Kieran across from me, Priscilla beside him. Serafina to my right, her hands folded calmly on the table. A young waitress approached, early 20s, blonde ponytail, the practiced smile of someone working the Sunday morning shift. "Coffee for 4, I said before anyone else could speak. "Black." She nodded and disappeared. Kieran watched her go, then turned back to me with an expression I recognized, the face he'd worn countless times before asking for money. Apologetic without being sorry. Reasonable without being right. "Dad," he said, his voice forcing a calm it didn't feel. "I think we need to talk about what happened." I said nothing. "Open the first folder instead." "Look, I know things got heated," Kieran continued, leaning forward slightly. "But we're family. We can work this out." I slid the first folder across the table. It made a soft whisper against the wood. Kieran glanced down. The property deed lay on top, my name alone in clear black ink at the header, owner of record, Otis Langley. Date of purchase, March 15th, 2005. He barely looked at it. "Dad, that's just a tax formality, right? For the deduction." I opened the second folder, slid it across. 15 years of property tax receipts. Every payment bearing my signature. Every amount paid from an account Kieran had never accessed because he'd never needed to know it existed. Kieran's confidence flickered. "Dad, these are just paperwork. This doesn't—" "Keep reading," Serafina said quietly. I opened the third folder. Insurance records. Homeowner's policy in my name. Payments automated from my account coverage protecting a house my son believed he owned. Fourth folder. Mortgage history. Every monthly payment from 2005 to 2019. The final document stamped paid in full. Kieran picked up that one. His hands weren't quite steady. I don't understand what you're trying to prove here. I didn't answer. The waitress returned with 4 cups of coffee, set them down with careful precision, and left. Steam rose from each cup, curling in the morning light. I knew most would go cold, untouched. Silence. It turns out has a sound like snow falling on water, inevitable and absolute. 5th folder. Roof replacement invoice. $22,000. Date June 2018. The summer Kieran had complained about leaks, and I'd told him I'd handle it. He'd never asked how. Never wondered who paid. Never thought to check. 6th folder. Furnace replacement. $11,000. Winter 2020. 7th folder. Foundation repairs. $18,000. Spring 2021. The stack on Kieran's side of the table grew taller. The stack on mine disappeared folder by folder, year by year, receipt by receipt. Kieran stopped trying to speak. Just stared at each document as it appeared in front of him, his entire life laid out in contracts and canceled checks, every comfort he'd believed he'd earned, purchased by the man he'd thrown into December rain. The cafe hummed with normal Sunday morning sounds. Espresso machine hissing behind the counter. Quiet conversations at nearby tables, families, couples, friends meeting for brunch. Silverware clinking against plates. Someone laughing at a joke I couldn't hear. At our table, 20 years of illusion disintegrated folder by folder. 8th folder. Kieran's college tuition. 4 years full ride every semester paid in a lump sum before classes started. I'd told him it was a scholarship. He'd never questioned it. 9th folder. The first car, the second car, the third. Titles, registration, insurance. All in my name. All payments from my account. 10th folder. Wedding expenses. $53,000. The reception Priscilla had planned down to the hand-calligraphed place cards. The honeymoon in Tuscany. The photographer who'd charged $8,000 for 2 days of work. I had promised Serafina I wouldn't say anything. I was keeping that promise. The papers were saying everything I'd held inside for 20 years. Kieran's whisper was almost inaudible. All of it. You paid for all of it. I opened the 11th folder. His business startup capital. The loan he'd repaid, except I'd never deposited a single check. I'd framed the first one and put it in a drawer. The rest I'd just let him believe mattered. Each folder a year. Each receipt is a sacrifice. Each signature proof he'd never looked at. Priscilla had been sitting frozen beside him, watching the folders accumulate like snow in a storm. Suddenly, her hand shot out, grabbing one from the middle of the remaining stack folders I hadn't reached yet, documents I'd planned to present in order. Wait, she said, her voice sharp. What's this one? She opened it before I could respond. Her face changed. The folder she'd grabbed, the one I hadn't planned to show, until later, after the property documents, after the financial history, after Kieran had fully understood the foundation of his life, contained bank statements, transfer records, highlighted deposits into an account bearing a name Kieran didn't recognize, Priscilla Hastings. Her maiden name, her secret account, $47,000 siphoned over 6 months from the joint account she shared with my son. Priscilla's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. She looked up at me, then at Kieran, then back at the papers. The color drained from her face like water from a broken glass. Kieran still didn't understand what he was looking at, but he was about to. The folder Priscilla had grabbed contained 4 years of college tuition receipts, and every single one bore my signature. Not Kieran's mother's, not a family trust, mine. She flipped through the pages faster now, hands trembling slightly as comprehension dawned. Fall, semester 2001. Spring 2002. Summer session. Each term itemized, each amount paid in full before classes started. My signature at the bottom of every authorization, Otis Langley. Bank account number redacted for privacy, but the pattern is unmistakable semester after semester, year after year. Kieran leaned over to see what had shaken his wife. He took the folder from her hands and read the first page. Blinked. Read it again. Mom always said the tuition came from the family fund, he said slowly, looking up at me. I thought. My fund, I said. 2 words. That was all it took. The implications settled over the table like snow. There had never been a separate family trust. No mysterious inheritance from a distant relative. No scholarship fund established by Helen's side of the family. Just my accounts, my paychecks, my decisions to pay tuition bills without ever mentioning them to the son who benefited. Priscilla's voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. He didn't know. He really didn't know. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to herself, processing a reality that redrew the entire map of her marriage. Kieran turned the pages. Undergraduate degree 4 years at UNC Chapel Hill. Graduate program 2 years for an MBA. Every semester paid before the deadline. Never a late fee. Never a missed payment. Never a single question from the student about where the money came from. I slid the next folder across the table. Kieran looked down at it like it might bite him. This one was thicker. Business documents, incorporation papers, wire transfer records from 12 years ago. He opened it. The initial investment that launched his consulting firm, $60,000. His name appeared nowhere on the wire transfer authorization. Only mine. The date, March 2013. The month he'd called me excited about finally starting his own business, finally proving he could build something himself. The startup capital, Kieran said, his voice hollow. I thought that was a loan. It was, Serafina said quietly. You just never paid it back, or acknowledged it. I reached for another folder. Office lease deposit. $8,000. Security deposit for equipment. $12,000. First 6 months of payroll during the lean startup phase when Kieran couldn't make ends meet. $43,000 parceled out in monthly transfers he'd probably assumed were client payments or investment returns. Another folder. Business insurance policies in my name protecting assets. Kieran had told investors belonged to him. Equipment financing I'd co-signed because the bank wouldn't approve him a loan. Emergency operating loans during the recession, each one approved because my name backed the request. A self-made man is a beautiful myth. The truth is, we're all built by someone. The only question is whether we remember to say thank you. Kieran had never said thank you because he'd never known there was anything to thank me for. The architecture of his career lay spread across the cafe table now. Every brick was placed by my hand, while he told investors he'd built it from scratch. While he told Priscilla he was a visionary entrepreneur. While he told himself, and I watched him believe it, that he'd earned his success. I didn't know, Kieran said, turning to Priscilla. His voice cracked. You have to believe me, I didn't know all of this. But Priscilla wasn't looking at the folders anymore. She was looking at him. Something fundamental had shifted in her expression, the way you might look at a stranger wearing a familiar face. The man she'd married had claimed he was self-made, ambitious, capable of providing the life she wanted. He'd talked about his business acumen, his strategic thinking, his ability to close deals and read markets. Now she was seeing the truth, a 42-year-old man who'd never asked where his tuition came from, who'd never questioned who funded his business, who'd never once looked at the foundation beneath his feet and wondered whose hands had poured it. I watched my son discover he was not who he thought he was. It should have felt like victory. It felt like grief. Dad, Kieran started, then stopped. I tried again. There has to be some way to fix this. I said nothing. Just sat in my chair with my coffee growing cold and watched him understand that some things once broken don't go back together. The house, Kieran said, his mind working through the implications. The cars, my education, the business, all of it, Serafina confirmed softly. Priscilla stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor, loud in the quiet cafe. Other customers glanced over, then looked away when they saw her face. "I need air," she said to no one in particular. She walked to the cafe entrance, pushed through the door, and stood on the sidewalk with her arms wrapped around herself despite the December cold. Through the window I could see her staring at the street. Not crying, not moving, just standing there, while the life she thought she'd married crumbled inside a folder full of receipts. Kieran watched her go but didn't follow. He set the last folder down slowly, his hands flat on the table on either side of it, like he was trying to steady himself against an earthquake. When he looked up at me, the negotiating confidence from earlier was gone. The casual assumption that we were just two adults working out a misunderstanding had evaporated. What remained was something close to desperation. "All right," he said quietly. "What do you want?" The question hung in the air between us. The cafe sounds continued around it. Espresso machine conversation. Someone's phone ringing. But at our table there was only silence and the sound of folders breathing their truths. Kieran waited for my answer, still believing this was a transaction, still thinking I wanted something from him. He didn't understand yet that wanting something requires believing the other person has something to give. And my son sitting across from me, surrounded by evidence of his dependence with his wife, standing outside, reconsidering every assumption she'd made about who he was, had nothing I needed anymore. But Serafina did have one more folder to share. And this one would hurt him in a different way entirely. Serafina reached across the table and placed her own folder in front of Kieran, not one of mine, but one she'd brought from her investigation. "What's this?" Kieran asked, his voice wary. Serafina didn't answer, just opened it. The first page was a bank statement. Not the joint checking account Kieran recognized, but a different one. The account holder's name appeared at the top in small bureaucratic print: Priscilla Hastings. Her maiden name. Kieran leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. Serafina flipped to the next page, then the next. 4 months of statements, each one showing the same pattern: transfers in. Small amounts, 1,500 here, 2,000 there. Dates highlighted in yellow marker. "I've been monitoring the joint accounts since July," Serafina said quietly. "These transfers started in August." Kieran picked up the first statement. His finger traced down the column of deposits. August 3rd, August 17th, September 1st, September 14th. Each one deliberate, each one small enough not to trigger alerts from the bank's fraud detection. Priscilla's face had gone from pale to ashen. "This account," Kieran said slowly, reading the header again. "This is your maiden name." She didn't answer, didn't look up. Just sat frozen, staring at a spot on the table where the wood grain swirled into a knot. Serafina pulled out a summary sheet from the back of the folder. Handwritten in her precise attorney's script, total transferred $47,000. While Kieran and Priscilla had been conspiring to evict me from the house I owned, Priscilla had been conspiring alone to abandon him. 6 months of systematic withdrawals from their shared account, building an escape fund Kieran knew nothing about. A betrayal within a betrayal. Before I reveal how Kieran handled his wife's ultimate betrayal, I want to ask you. Do you think a man like him would swallow his pride and confront her, or simply turn his anger back on me? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Kieran set the statements down carefully, like they might explode if handled roughly. He turned slowly to look at his wife. For the first time all morning, something other than defensiveness crossed his face. Genuine shock. Hurt. The bewilderment of someone discovering they've been betrayed while orchestrating a betrayal themselves. "Priscilla," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "Priscilla, look at me." She didn't. The silence was its own confession. No explanation. No excuse. No performance. Just the weight of months of planning sitting in a folder between them. Kieran sat back in his chair, processing the layers. While he'd conspired with her to throw his father into December rain, she'd been preparing to throw him to the same cold. The parallels were almost poetic. Betrayal has an echo. When you hear it bounce back at you, there's a choice: listen and learn, or cover your ears and shout louder. For perhaps 10 seconds, Kieran was not the villain of this story. He was the victim. I watched that moment, seeing something almost like self-awareness flicker across his face, the recognition that what Priscilla had done to him was exactly what he'd done to me. He could have sat with that, could have let it teach him something. "Did you know about this?" Kieran asked, turning to me. His voice was almost pleading. "Before Christmas, did you know she was—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the word. "Leaving." I met his eyes but said nothing. The moment passed. Kieran's face hardened. The vulnerability disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, swallowed by something older and more familiar. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists on the table. Instead of reflection, instead of recognizing the parallel between how he'd treated me and how Priscilla had treated him, he chose the easier path. He chose anger. "This is a trap," he said, his voice rising. Other customers in the cafe glanced over. "You set us up." He stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor, loud in the Sunday morning quiet. "All of this." He continued, gesturing at the folders spread across the table. "The timing, the investigation, the folders. You planned this." He pointed at me, then at Serafina. "You've been watching us for months, waiting for the perfect moment to what, humiliate us, destroy us." "Nobody set you up, Kieran," Serafina said calmly. "We just stopped cleaning up after you." "Stopped cleaning up?" Kieran's laugh was bitter. "You orchestrated this whole thing. The eviction notice is 30 days before Christmas. The cafe meeting. Her—" he gestured at Serafina. "Investigating my wife like some kind of private detective. This is revenge. This is the consequence," I said. The first words I'd spoken since the folders started sliding across the table. My voice was quiet, but it cut through Kieran's rising volume like a knife through paper. "You ordered me out of my own house." I continued, my tone unchanged. "Your wife slapped me across the face at Christmas dinner. You've spent 20 years taking everything I built and calling it yours. These aren't traps, Kieran. They're just facts. You could have talked to me," Kieran said, his voice breaking slightly. "You could have just told me." "I tried. For 20 years I tried. For 10 seconds my son had a chance to see himself clearly. He chose blindness instead." "No," Kieran said, shaking his head. "No, you wanted this. You wanted me to fail. You've been planning this for months, maybe years, just waiting for an excuse to—" "To what?" I asked. "To stop funding a life you never appreciated. To stop signing checks you never thanked me for. To stop being invisible in a house I paid for." Kieran's breathing was hard now, his chest rising and falling like he'd been running. Around us, the cafe had gone quiet. Other patrons watching this family drama unfold over coffee and cinnamon rolls. A father and son at war over folders of truth. Priscilla still hadn't said a word. Still sat frozen, staring at that knot in the wood grain like it held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. Kieran stood above the table, breathing hard, finger still pointed at me in accusation. He thought he'd found the answer, thought he'd identified the villain, thought that blaming me for orchestrating his downfall would somehow absolve him of the choices that led here. He still didn't know the real foundation hadn't even been revealed yet, because I had 2 more folders on my side of the table, and these would hurt in a way money never could. I didn't stand, didn't argue, didn't defend myself against my son's accusation. I simply reached for the next folder. Kieran was still on his feet, still pointing, still mid-accusation about traps and orchestration and revenge. His breathing was hard, his face flushed. Around us, the cafe had gone quiet enough that I could hear the espresso machine hissing behind the counter. I opened the folder and slid it across the table. Kieran's finger slowly lowered. He looked down at what I'd placed in front of him. Medical records, Duke University Hospital letterhead at the top. My name. A diagnosis date, June 14th, 2025. 6 months ago. He picked up the first page. I started reading. I watched his eyes move across the text, saw the exact moment he found the word. His lips moved silently, forming the syllables cardiomyopathy, last will and testament, dated June 17th, 2025. 3 days after the diagnosis had been confirmed, 3 days after I'd sat in Dr. Brennan's office and learned exactly how much time I probably had left. Kieran's hands trembled as he pulled the will toward him. The language was precise, the structure meticulous. Desmond had spent weeks getting it exactly right. Page 1 detailed the assets, the house in Dilworth, the investment accounts, the patents I'd secured years ago, the business holdings, the trust funds. Everything. Page 2 specified the beneficiary, Kieran Langley's son. Page 2 also specified the transfer date, December 25th, 2025, Christmas Day. Kieran read that line twice. His finger traced under the date like he was trying to make sense of it. Then he turned to page 3, the condition clause. His lips moved as he read it aloud, disbelief creeping into his voice with every word. Contingent upon the beneficiary demonstrating the dignity and respect befitting a son toward the grantor during the period between execution of this will and the specified transfer date. He looked up at me. I said nothing. He kept reading. Any act of severe disrespect, verbal hostility, or eviction of the grantor automatically triggers nullification of this bequest and transfers all specified assets to the Helen Langley Memorial Foundation for Families in Need. Effective immediately upon occurrence. Irreversible. The cafe sounds continued around us. Someone's phone rang. The espresso machine hissed again. A child laughed at a table near the window. A failing heart has a way of clarifying what matters. I'd had 18 months to decide what to do with my remaining time. Kieran had 18 months to prove he deserved it. You had everything, Kieran, Serafina said softly. It was yours, all of it. You just had to not throw him out. Kieran's whisper was barely audible. Christmas Eve. The slap. That's when he set the will down. I picked it up. Read the trigger clause again, slower this time, as if hoping the words would change. They didn't. December 24th, 2025. The explosive confrontation at the dinner table. Priscilla shouting and slamming her glass down while the Christmas lights blinked outside. Kieran's voice cold and final. Get out of my house and don't ever come back. He'd triggered it himself. The house, the business, the comfortable life, all of it had been real. All of it had been his for the taking. He just had to treat his father with basic human decency on Christmas Eve. He couldn't. Kieran read the will a third time, his eyes moving across the same paragraphs, the same clauses, the same irreversible consequences of his own actions. When he finally set it down, his hands were shaking. I had it, he said, his voice hollow. I had all of it. And he couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We all knew how it ended. For the first time since arriving at the cafe, Kieran was not angry, not defensive, not calculating. He was simply empty. A man staring at the smoking ruins of a future he'd burned with his own hands. Inheritance is a gift that can only be given, never taken. The moment you demand it, you've already lost it. I placed both hands flat on the table and stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. My chair scraped against the floor. Kieran looked up at me like a drowning man watching a boat sail past. You threw me out of my own house, son, I said. My voice was quiet but steady. That was your choice. What happens now? Kieran asked. Not defiant, not angry, just asking. I looked at him for a long moment. I saw the boy I'd raised. The man he'd become, the stranger sitting across from me, surrounded by evidence of every opportunity he'd wasted. Now, I said, you learn to live with what you've done, same as everyone else. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. The fabric was heavy in my hands, real and solid in a way the conversation had stopped being hours ago. Serafina stood with me. She'd been quiet through most of this, letting the folders speak, letting her brother discover his own choices, reflected back at him in legal documents and bank statements. Kieran remained seated. His hands were still on the will fingers resting on the trigger claws, like if he pressed hard enough, he could push back through time and choose differently. Priscilla hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. She sat frozen beside him, her own folder of secrets still on the table, her escape fund exposed, her plans dismantled. I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard movement. Kieran standing, maybe. Or just shifting in his chair, still trying to process the magnitude of self-inflicted loss. Then his voice one more time. "Dad, wait." I didn't stop walking. The winter sunlight outside the cafe was almost painful after the dim warmth inside, sharp, clean, honest, in a way the conversation had never been. Serafina and I stood on the sidewalk, our breath visible in the December cold. Behind us, the cafe door swung shut with a soft chime. I pulled my coat tighter and turned toward the parking lot. 30 seconds later, the door opened again. Priscilla emerged, moving quickly, her head down, purse clutched against her chest. She didn't look at us, didn't look back. Just walked with purpose toward the far end of the parking lot, where a silver sedan waited, not the repossessed SUV, someone else's car. Serafina watched her. She's not even going to say anything. What would she say? I asked. She made her choice months ago. Priscilla reached the sedan. A man I didn't recognize sat in the driver's seat. She climbed in, pulled the door shut, and the car backed out. Just like that, she was gone. No goodbye. No excuse. No acknowledgement of the wreckage. Not the marriage, not the betrayal exposed in those folders, not the money she'd siphoned while planning her exit. I watched the sedan merge into traffic and felt nothing. Not satisfied. Not vindication. Just the neutral observation of someone removing themselves from a story they were never truly invested in beyond what it could provide. I suppose we all did, Serafina said quietly. Another minute passed. The cafe door opened a third time. Kieran stepped out and stopped 10 feet from where we stood. He didn't approach, didn't leave. Just stood there with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. The emptiness from inside remained in his eyes. Not anger anymore. Not calculation. Just profound blankness, the look of someone whose entire self-image has collapsed. I looked at my son and saw the pattern, someone who'd never learned to say, "I'm sorry," someone who still didn't understand that silence wasn't strength, someone who could stand in ruins of his own choices and still not know what words to offer. He cleared his throat. "I don't know what to say." "I know," I said quietly. "That's always been the problem." Traffic moved past. A family walked out of the cafe behind Kieran, laughing, bundling children into coats. Normal Sunday sounds while our family fractured in a parking lot. How do you forgive someone who isn't sorry? You don't. You simply stop waiting for an apology that will never come. Kieran shifted his weight. I looked at the ground. I looked back up. "Will I see you again?" he asked. The question hung in the cold air. I could have said yes. Could have left the door open for some future reconciliation. But I thought about the medical records. About 3 to 5 years if treatment went well. About 18 months spent watching him take everything for granted. "I don't know," I said. The most honest answer I could give. Kieran nodded slowly, like he'd expected that. He looked at me for another long moment. Not angry. Not pleading. Just looking. Then he turned and started walking down the sidewalk, hands still in his pockets. I watched him go. Watch him reach the corner, pause for just a second, like maybe he'd turn around. He didn't. He rounded the corner and disappeared. Serafina and I stood alone in the parking lot. Traffic continued. A car alarm chirped somewhere. Ordinary sounds surrounding the extraordinary quiet of watching someone you love walk away. I had spent 20 years trying to save my son. Standing in that parking lot, I finally understood some people can only save themselves if they choose to at all. Serafina took my hand. She hadn't done that since she was a child. Her voice was soft. "Are you ready, Dad?" I looked at her confused. "For the trip?" She shook her head gently. "To stop worrying. To stop carrying him. To stop wondering if this time will be different." The question settled between us like snow on water. I looked back once at the cafe. Through the window I could see our table empty now, a waitress approaching to clear the folders, to wipe down the wood, to prepare for the next customers who would sit there without knowing what had just transpired. Inside that cafe, my son had learned that the life he thought he'd built had been funded by the father he'd evicted. That the inheritance he'd assumed was automatic had been conditional. That he'd destroyed his own future with a single act of cruelty on Christmas Eve. And even knowing all of that, he still couldn't apologize. I turned back to Serafina. I looked at her hand in mine, at the concern in her eyes, at the daughter who'd stayed, who'd investigated, who'd stood beside me while her brother burned every bridge. "Yes," I said simply. "I'm ready. Ready to stop checking my phone for calls that wouldn't come. Ready to stop making excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused. Ready to stop believing that one more conversation would somehow transform him into someone who valued what he'd been given. Ready to live whatever time I had left without the weight of someone else's choices pressing down on every breath." Serafina squeezed my hand. "Good. Because you deserve to actually live the rest of your life instead of just managing his." The silence after the cafe meeting wasn't the kind that fills with noise. Eventually, it was the kind that settles in and stays heavy and absolute. Freedom and peace, I learned in those first days, could indeed coexist. But the learning was quiet work, the kind that happens in hotel rooms and morning walks, and conversations with Serafina about trips we'd take and places Helen had always wanted to see. I didn't know exactly what Kieran's days looked like in that first week. I didn't call, didn't check, didn't drive past wherever he'd ended up. But I understood the shape of them anyway, the way you understand the architecture of a house you built, even after someone else moves in. He was sitting somewhere alone. Serafina told me later what she'd pieced together from public records and a few discreet inquiries. A rental apartment in East Charlotte, the kind of place that accepted week-to-week payments and didn't ask many questions. 600 square feet. One room. Walls painted landlord beige that had faded to something closer to gray. I pictured him there, on a folding chair he'd probably bought at a discount store, staring at blank walls in a space that contained almost nothing. A mattress on the floor, a single lamp, clothes in plastic bags because he couldn't afford a dresser yet, or maybe because buying furniture felt like admitting this was permanent. The silence in that apartment would be different from the silence I was experiencing. His would be interrupted by sounds from neighboring units, proof that life continued for other people while his had stopped. Footsteps overhead, a television through thin walls, someone's music playing too loud, bass thumping through the floor. I wondered if he picked up his phone. If he pulled up my contact, thumb hovering over the call button, the way I'd seen him hesitate over difficult decisions his whole life. I wondered if he pressed it. Then I realized I was wondering and I stopped. Serafina had asked if I could stop worrying. I was learning that the answer was yes. December 30th passed. December 31st. New Year's Eve came and went while I sat in my hotel room reading a book Helen had recommended years ago, finally getting around to the stories she'd loved. At midnight, fireworks echoed across Charlotte. I heard them through my window and thought about the years I'd spent at New Year's parties in the Dilworth house watching Kieran drink champagne and make toasts to futures he'd never have to work for. This year I went to bed at 10:30 and slept through midnight entirely. January 2nd. I took a morning walk. January 3rd, Serafina and I looked at travel brochures for Cannon Beach. January 4th, I realized I'd gone 3 full days without thinking about my son. Silence is a teacher. With only one lesson, you are exactly as strong as you are when no one is watching. I didn't know if Kieran was learning that lesson. Serafina mentioned carefully that she'd heard through a friend who worked at a bank that Priscilla had closed the joint account on December 30th. Withdrew every dollar what little remained after her months of systematic transfers and disappeared. No forwarding address, no phone calls, no explanation. The woman who'd slapped me across the face at Christmas dinner, who'd conspired with Kieran to evict me from my own house, who'd been planning her exit for half a year while pretending to be a loyal wife, she'd vanished the moment the money dried up. For the first time since he was 18 years old, Kieran was entirely alone. No wife, no father, no safety net. I felt something when Serafina told me this, but it wasn't satisfying. It was closer to recognition, the understanding that some people are only present for what you can provide, and the moment you stop providing, you discover they were never really there at all. Priscilla had taught Kieran a lesson I'd been trying to teach him for years. I hoped he was paying attention. I didn't know if Kieran was learning that lesson. I knew only that for the first time in 20 years, it wasn't my job to teach it. On January 5th, a Sunday cold and clear, I imagined Kieran sitting in that rental apartment with his laptop, the one possession he'd managed to keep. I pictured him logging into his bank account and seeing what remained after a week of buying groceries and paying for that folding chair and trying to stretch every dollar. $243 maybe. Something close to that. Rent due in 25 days. I pictured him opening a job search website. Something he hadn't done since he was 22 before I funded his consulting firm, before he started calling himself an entrepreneur, before he convinced himself that success was something he'd earned rather than something someone had given him. The listings would scroll past. Assistant manager at a retail store. Customer service representative. Warehouse supervisor. Ordinary jobs. Honest jobs. Jobs that required showing up every day and working, not networking over expensive lunches and delegating to people you'd hired with someone else's capital. I imagined him stopping at one listing. Operations coordinator. $45,000 a year. Benefits after 90 days. The salary was less than he used to spend on car payments. I imagined him reading the requirements. High school diploma required. No experience necessary. I will train. He had a master's degree. 12 years running a company that I'd funded from the ground up. And he was looking at entry-level positions that promised to train him like he'd never worked before. Because in the way that mattered, he hadn't. I imagined his cursor hovering over the Apply Now button, his finger resting on the touchpad. That moment of recognition crystallized into something closer to acceptance. I have to work, he'd be thinking. Actually work. No one's going to save me. Not his father. Not his wife. Not some investor who'd be impressed by his resume and overlook the gap in his employment where he'd lost everything because he threw his own father out on Christmas Eve. Just him. Just the work. Just the humbling reality that survival requires effort, and nobody owes you comfort. I didn't know if he pressed that button, but sitting in my hotel room on January 5th, looking at travel brochures for a trip to fulfill a promise I'd made to Helen 20 years ago, I realized something I didn't need to know. Kieran's cursor hovered over the Apply Now button, his finger resting on the touchpad. $45,000 a year. Entry level. A job where he'd have a boss, where he'd take orders, where he'd be nobody special. The kind of job he'd once believed was beneath him. Pressing that button would be the easiest and hardest thing he'd done in years. Kieran pressed the apply button on January 6th, got the interview call on January 8th, and started work on January 10th. 3 milestones that would have been unremarkable for anyone else but felt like stepping off a cliff. I learned these details later, pieced together from things Serafina mentioned, and gaps I filled in with the understanding that comes from having raised someone for 42 years. I didn't witness his first day, didn't call to wish him luck or offer advice, but I knew the shape of it anyway. He would have arrived at 7:45 for an 8 o'clock start, the way people do when they're nervous about being late to something that matters. The logistics company occupied a modest building in an industrial park, the kind of place with fluorescent lights and gray carpet, and motivational posters in the break room. Marcus Caldwell, 32 and professionally efficient, had managed teams for 8 years and treated every new hire the same fair expectations. Zero favoritism, no interest in their backstory. He would have shown Kieran to a desk in a row of identical desks, logged him into a computer, explained the break room schedule and the daily update requirements. "You'll report to me." Marcus would have said, his tone neither warm nor cold. "Daily updates by 4 p.m. Questions go through proper channels. We run a tight ship, but if you work hard, there's room to move up." Kieran would have forced his most professional tone. "Understood. Thank you for the opportunity." Marcus would have nodded, already moving on to his next task, not seeing the expression on Kieran's face as he sat down at that desk. Not recognizing that the man in front of him had once had his own office, his own company, his own belief that he'd never have to answer to anyone. For the first time in 12 years, Kieran had a boss. For the first time in his adult life, his opinions didn't automatically matter. The humiliation wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet kind that accumulates in small moments of being told what to do. The days would have blurred into a pattern Kieran had never experienced. Alarm at 6:30 hitting snooze once before forcing himself vertical. Instant coffee because the good kind was $3 more, and he was calculating every purchase now. Bus at 7:15 because he had no car standing in the aisle when seats filled up, avoiding eye contact with strangers who had their own problems. At work, he entered data into spreadsheets, confirmed shipment schedules, answered emails from warehouse managers who didn't know he once ran his own consulting firm, who treated him exactly like what he was: entry-level coordinator, $45,000 a year, benefits after 90 days. "I used to complain about traffic in my BMW," he'd think on the bus. "Now I'm grateful this thing runs on time." Humiliation is patient. It doesn't announce itself with fanfares. It arrives in the third week of eating pasta because chicken costs $2 more. Evenings he'd return to the rental apartment as daylight faded. January in Charlotte meant darkness by 6 cold that seeped through walls too thin. He'd stand in the grocery store doing math: $3 for pasta, $5 for chicken breast, $18 left until Friday's paycheck. He'd choose the pasta. Back at the apartment, he'd heat water on the 2-burner stove dump in dried noodles. Eat standing up because the folding chair hurt his back, and he couldn't afford anything better yet. Then he'd wash the single pot, the single fork, the single bowl in a sink too small for proper dishes. "This is my life now," he'd think. "This is actually my life." The bathroom needed cleaning. He'd stare at the toilet, the grimy tile, and realize he'd never actually cleaned a bathroom before. Someone had always done it for him. His mother when he was young. Cleaning services after that. Priscilla occasionally, though, more often she'd hired someone. Now it was just him and a sponge from the dollar store, and the understanding that nobody was coming to do this for him. These details hurt more than losing millions ever did. Millions are abstract numbers on a screen, concepts you can explain away or blame on market forces or legal technicalities. But washing dishes alone in a silent apartment at 9 p.m. is concrete, immediate, undeniable proof of how far you've fallen. I didn't know my son was staring at my number every night. If I had, would it have changed anything? I don't think so. Some lessons only work if you learn them alone. On January 15th, a Wednesday, cold and ordinary Kieran would have finished another day of taking orders from Marcus about shipment schedules that didn't interest him, coordinating deliveries. He didn't care about being professional to people who would never know he'd once believed himself above this kind of work. He'd have ridden the bus home in the dark. Stopped at the grocery store, pasta again, $18 until Friday. Back to the apartment where the heat barely worked and his breath fogged when he exhaled. Microwaved pasta. No sauce because sauce cost extra. Just butter and salt and the mechanical action of eating because his body required fuel. Then he'd have sat on the floor, the folding chair abandoned in favor of carpet that smelled faintly of whoever lived there before him. and pulled out his phone. My contact would still be there. Dad. Mobile. The number he'd looked at every single day for 2 weeks without pressing a call. His thumb would hover. What would he say? I'm working at a logistics company for $45,000 a year. You were right about everything. I'm sorry I threw you out on Christmas Eve and destroyed my own inheritance. He wouldn't know which would be true. Wouldn't know if any of them would matter. Just press call, he'd whisper to himself. Just do it. But then the questions would come and say what? That I'm sorry, that I need him, that I'm drowning. He'd set the phone down face first on the carpet. Maybe it was pride keeping him from calling. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was stubborn refusal to admit he needed help. The truth was, he didn't know which, and that might have been the most honest thing he'd acknowledged in years. Tomorrow, he'd tell himself. I'll call tomorrow, knowing he wouldn't. I folded the last shirt, a gray flannel Helen bought me in 2019, and laid it flat in the suitcase beside 3 books, 2 pairs of jeans, and the framed photo of her at Sequoia National Park. While Kieran sat in his rental apartment staring at my number and promising himself tomorrow, I was packing for a journey we'd planned 20 years ago. The distance between us was already measured in more than miles. The hotel room had become familiar over the past month. Clean, functional, anonymous in the way temporary spaces are. I'd brought almost nothing with me when I left the Dilworth house on Christmas Eve, and I was leaving with even less now. I picked up Helen's favorite poetry collection, Mary Oliver Pages, soft from years of her reading, and placed it in the suitcase. 2 more books, a biography I'd been meaning to read, and a guide to the Oregon coast. 1 jacket, toiletries. Everything I needed fit in a single carry-on. The framed photo required more care. Helen at Sequoia National Park, 43 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. I wrapped it in a soft sweater and nestled it between the books where it wouldn't shift during travel. I'd spent 20 years in a mansion full of possessions, furniture. I'd paid for art, I'd selected rooms I'd filled with the accumulation of a comfortable life. Standing in this hotel room with everything that mattered packed into one bag, I understood what Helen had meant when she said, we could live on a beach with nothing but books and coffee. She'd been right. She'd been right about so many things. A knock at the door interrupted my packing. Serafina stood in the hallway holding a folder. Foundation paperwork, she said. Final signatures. I let her in. She set the folder on the small desk and opened it with the practiced efficiency of an attorney who'd done this hundreds of times. Everything's complete, she said. Legal structure filed board-appointed Desmond a community education advocate and the director of Charlotte's literacy program. The endowment is fully funded. I pulled out the chair and sat. The first page showed the foundation name in formal legal print, the Helen Langley Educational Fund. Seeing her name there, permanent official, attached to something that would outlive both of us, made my throat tight. 4.2 million. Serafina continued flipping to the financial summary. First scholarships awarded to 3 students. Full ride 4 years, each renewable based on academic performance. She showed me the list. 3 names. 3 kids from Kieran's former private school district. The wealthy area where he'd grown up, believing the world owed him everything. Except these kids hadn't grown up wealthy. They'd won spots in that district through lottery programs and academic merit, attending the same schools as children like Kieran, while their parents worked 2 jobs to afford the supplies and field trips that other families paid for without thinking. Now they had scholarships, full rides. Because the money Kieran thought he'd inherit had gone somewhere it would actually matter. Helen would be proud, Serafina said softly. I signed the documents, my hand steady. She always wanted to do this. I just never listened. You're listening now. She pulled out another folder. Travel confirmations. Train tickets for January 21st, tomorrow. Charlotte to Portland, connecting to a smaller coastal line. 6-month rental already paid for in a town called Cannon Beach, the place Helen had circled in travel magazines for 20 years, while I'd said, next summer, we'll go next summer. Next summer had become never come, until now. "You're sure about this?" Serafina asked. "Very sure." She nodded, started to say something else, but my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Desmond. "I should take this," I said. Serafina stood, gave me privacy by stepping into the bathroom. I answered. "Otis?" Desmond's voice was warm. "The foundation board met this morning. I wanted you to know the scholarship recipients before it becomes official." Serafina just showed me the list. "Did she tell you about Maria Miller?" I paused. "That name sounds familiar." "Rosa Miller's daughter. Rosa worked as your household cook for what was it, 12 years. The memory crystallized. Rosa. Quiet, efficient, always arriving early and leaving late. I'd paid her minimum wage because that's what Kieran had said was standard for household staff. She'd smiled and said thank you and never complained. "Maria's attending UNC Chapel Hill this fall," Desmond continued. "Engineering major. The scholarship covers everything: tuition, housing, books." Rosa cried when they told her. Money that had once paid Rosa minimum wage to cook meals for people who never thanked her was now funding her daughter's education at one of the best universities in the state. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the rightness of it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "You did a good thing, Otis. Helen would be proud." That's what Serafina said. We ended the call. Serafina emerged from the bathroom, saw my expression. "Good news, good news." She smiled, gathered her folders. "I'll let you finish packing. Train leaves at 9:15 tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at 8. After she left, I returned to the suitcase. Almost done. Just the toiletries and the jacket draped over the chair. My phone vibrated. Not a call this time. Just the buzz of movement on the nightstand. I looked at the screen. "Kieran, incoming call." I watched it ring, once, twice, 3 times. 6 months ago, I would have answered to gloat. 3 months ago, I would have answered to argue. Now I just wanted silence. I picked up the phone, turned it over, and placed it face down on the nightstand. The vibration continued for another few seconds, then stopped. I folded the jacket, packed the toiletries, zipped the suitcase closed. The latches clicked into place, 2 metallic snaps in the silent room. I looked around one last time. Bare walls, stripped bed, empty closet, a month of living reduced to checkout and a single bag. The phone still lay face down on the nightstand. A faint glow showed through the case missed call notification. I picked it up, slid it into my pocket without looking at the screen, and walked to the light switch. Tomorrow I'd board a train to the coast. Tomorrow I'd begin fulfilling a promise 20 years deferred. Tomorrow I'd see if Helen's dream of living simply by the ocean was as peaceful as she'd believed. Tonight, I turned off the light and walked out of that hotel room for the last time, leaving behind the life I'd spent 2 decades building and the son who'd thrown it away with his own hands. On January 21st, Kieran woke at 6:15 a.m. to the alarm he'd set on a phone with a cracked screen he couldn't afford to replace. I knew this because I'd driven past the apartment complex once 3 weeks earlier on my way back from a cardiologist appointment. I hadn't stopped. I'd simply noted the building, a 4-story brick structure with rusted railings and a parking lot full of dented sedans, and continued driving. Later, Serafina mentioned she'd heard from someone at the country club that Kieran was working warehouse shifts 6 days a week. I asked her not to tell me more, but I imagined it anyway. The alarm at 6:15. The bus at 6:47 smelled like diesel and sweat. The warehouse floor where he lifted boxes for 9 hours, surrounded by men who didn't know he'd once belonged to the Ashford Country Club, didn't care that his mother had chaired the Historical Society. I imagined him microwaving dinners in that efficient apartment, eating alone at a folding table, the television playing shows he wasn't watching. 4 days passed like that. January 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. I didn't think about him constantly. That would suggest I was waiting for something, watching for redemption or collapse. I wasn't. The loop had closed. Kieran was living the consequences I'd designed, and I'd moved on to living what remained of my own life. On January 25th, I attended the Helen Langley Memorial Scholarship Fund ceremony at the Charlotte Museum of Art. The event hall was elegant, without being ostentatious, tall windows overlooking the sculpture garden, white tablecloths, arrangements of winter roses Helen would have approved of. Serafina had organized everything. She stood near the entrance in a navy dress greeting arrivals with the same grace Helen had possessed. Desmond was beside her, looking uncomfortable in his suit, but present solid. They'd selected 3 recipients this year. The first was a young man studying engineering at NC State, the son of a single mother who cleaned office buildings. The second was a girl heading to UNC School of the Arts for dance, her father, a mechanic who'd worked 2 jobs to keep her in lessons. I shook their hands, said the things Helen would have said about potential and opportunity and giving back. Then Rosa Miller approached the podium. I recognized her immediately, though I hadn't seen her in years. She'd worked for us as a cook for 12 years, arriving at 6 a.m., 6 days a week, to prepare meals. Helen could no longer manage herself during the worst of her illness. We'd paid her minimum wage because that's what Kieran had recommended when he managed the household accounts. Market rate, he'd called it. Rosa had never complained, had simply showed up every morning and left every evening invisible. Now she stood at the microphone, 63 years old, with silver in her black hair, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter, Maria," she said, voice breaking. "She's going to Duke. Pre-med. Because of Mrs. Langley's fund, because of this family's generosity, my daughter is going to be a doctor." The room applauded. I looked at Maria Miller, 19, brilliant-eyed, wearing a dress Rosa had probably saved for months to buy, and felt something crack open in my chest. Not redemption. Not absolution. Just the simple, terrible beauty of a consequence I hadn't planned, a loop I hadn't closed. Helen's money, the money Kieran had thought was his, was sending Rosa's daughter to Duke. Was this what justice looked like? Not revenge, not punishment, but resources flowing to the people who'd been invisible all along. After the ceremony, Serafina drove me back to the Ritz-Carlton. She didn't mention Kieran, neither did I. We talked about the scholarship fund's investment strategy, about whether to expand to Davidson County next year, about the winter roses in the arrangements. Back in my suite, I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. 3 emails waited. The first was from Desmond Halifax, confirming the Oregon cottage lease was fully executed and the property ready for occupancy on January 28th. The second was from Dr. Brennan's office, reminding me about my February cardiology follow-up. The third was from Delta Airlines. Your flight confirmation, January 28th, 2026, 6:40 a.m., Charlotte Douglas International to Portland International. One way. Seat 12A. 3 days. I sat back in the chair and looked out the window at Charlotte's skyline. Somewhere out there, Kieran was probably heating a microwave dinner, exhausted from lifting boxes, unaware that Rosa Miller's daughter was going to Duke on his would-be inheritance. Somewhere out there, Serafina was planning next year's scholarship ceremony. Somewhere out there, the house on Woodland Drive sat empty, waiting for the bank to auction it to strangers. And in 3 days, I'd be gone. I thought about calling Kieran. Not to reconcile, there was nothing to reconcile. Not to explain, I'd already explained everything in that final conversation at the hotel. Just to hear his voice once more before I left North Carolina forever. Then I consciously released the thought. Let it go. I watched it drift away like smoke. I spread the printed boarding pass, passport, and rental agreement across the hotel desk on the morning of January 26th. 2 days. 48 hours until the flight, until I left North Carolina forever. The documents looked ordinary, laid out in the morning light. Just paper and ink, administrative artifacts of a life transition. But they represented something more, the final arrangement of a man who'd spent 68 years accumulating obligations and was now down to 3 pieces of paper and a carry-on suitcase. I picked up the passport first. Valid through 2028. The photo showed a version of me from 4 years ago, before Helen died, before the diagnosis, before I'd understood what consequences really meant. Then the boarding pass, Delta Flight 1247, January 28th, 6:40 a.m., Charlotte Douglas, to Portland International, seat 12A, window seat. I'd always preferred the window. The rental agreement was last 6 months paid in full for a furnished 2-bedroom cottage with ocean views. The property manager's email had included photos, weathered gray shingles, a wraparound porch, windows facing west toward the Pacific. The kind of place Helen had circled in travel magazines, the kind we'd always promised to visit next summer. I opened my laptop and checked the foundation account one more time. The Helen Langley Memorial Scholarship Fund showed a balance of $847,000, the full endowment safely transferred and generating returns for future scholars. Below that, my personal checking account showed $43,200. It was more than enough for 6 months of rent, coastal groceries, medications, and whatever peaceful moments came next. "I brought you something," she said, settling into the chair across from the desk. She opened the folder and pulled out printed maps, coastal Oregon Cannon Beach hiking trails along the cliffs. Beneath those were handwritten notes, local doctors who accepted my insurance, a pharmacy that delivered the name of a woman who ran a book club at the community center. "You've been researching," I said. "Someone has to make sure you don't disappear into the wilderness without a plan." She poured coffee into the thermos cap and slid it toward me. Cannon Beach. Mom talked about it every summer, so she'd figured it out. I shouldn't have been surprised. Serafina had always been the one who paid attention, who remembered the details everyone else forgot. "We were always going to go next year," I said. "Then next year never." She studied the rental agreement photo on my laptop screen, the cottage with its weathered shingles and ocean-facing windows. "You're going now. That counts." Did it? Helen's dream had gathered dust for 2 decades, buried under board meetings and quarterly reports. Now I was finally brushing it off, carrying it to the coast alone. Not the way we'd imagined it. Not the retirement trip we'd planned with her pointing out tide pools and seabirds, me pretending to enjoy the cold Pacific wind because her joy made it worthwhile. But I was going. That had to mean something. We spent the next hour reviewing the maps and contacts. Serafina had thought of everything: grocery delivery services, the nearest urgent care, even the local historical society in case I got bored. She asked practical questions about my medications, about whether I'd registered with a new cardiologist, about what I'd do if the cottage wasn't what the photos promised. I answered them all. It felt strange planning for a future that extended beyond revenge, beyond consequences, beyond the closed loop of what I'd done to Kieran. For months, my horizon had been January, the eviction, the revelations, the scholarship ceremony, the departure. Now I was looking at February, March, April. 6 months of rental agreement. Maybe longer if the heart held out. Eventually, Serafina folded the maps and tucked them back into the folder. She handed it to me, then hesitated. "Do you want to leave him a letter?" she asked quietly. "An address or—" "Your brother has my number. That's enough." She nodded slowly. "And if he calls, then he calls." I met her eyes. "But I'm not waiting to see if he does. What do you owe a son who never learned what you valued until you took it all away? A forwarding address or just the silence he earned?" I didn't know the answer. I just knew I wasn't going to spend my last functional months wondering if Kieran would choose to bridge the distance I'd created. The boundary was simple. He had my number, the same number he'd had for 42 years. If he wanted to use it, he would. If he didn't, that was answer enough. Serafina stood and hugged me at the door. "Call me when you land," she said, "and send pictures of the ocean." "I will. I love you, Dad. I love you too." She left, and the room felt larger without her in it. I packed the folder into my carry-on, checked the boarding pass one more time, and set my phone on the nightstand. No missed calls, no messages. Kieran hadn't tried again. The night of January 27th, I ordered room service salmon roasted vegetables, nothing I couldn't have made myself, but nice enough for a last meal in Charlotte. I ate slowly, watching the city lights through the hotel window, thinking about nothing in particular. Not Kieran's warehouse shifts or Serafina's folder of contacts, or the cottage waiting in Cannon Beach. Just the simple fact of being here now, with a flight to catch in the morning. At 11:30, I brushed my teeth, set the alarm for 4:30 a.m. and climbed into bed. I closed my eyes and didn't dream. Didn't wake up at 3 a.m. Didn't reach for my phone. I just slept. On the nightstand, my phone sat dark and silent. No calls, no messages, no last-minute pleas. At 11:47 p.m. on January 27th, I set the alarm for 4:30 a.m., closed my eyes and slept without waking until morning. The alarm rang at 4:30 a.m. on January 28th, and I woke before I could silence it. No disorientation, no grogginess, just the clean awareness of a man who'd slept through the night for the first time in years and was ready to leave. I showered, dressed in comfortable clothes suitable for travel, and packed the last items into my single carry-on bag. Medications, passport wallet, phone charger. Nothing else mattered. The hotel room looked impersonal in the pre-dawn darkness, already forgotten. I'd lived here for 6 weeks, but I'd left no mark on it. No books on the nightstand, no photos on the desk, no impression that Otis Langley had existed in this space at all. Just a man passing through, waiting for the right moment to continue moving. Serafina arrived at 5:15 headlights cutting through the parking garage shadows. I met her at the lobby entrance with my bag slung over one shoulder. She looked at the single carry-on, then at me. "You travel light for someone leaving forever." "I don't need much anymore." The drive to Charlotte Douglas International was quiet. The city was still sleeping, dark windows, empty streets, traffic lights cycling through their patterns for no one. We passed the exit for Woodland Drive, and neither of us mentioned it. Past the country club, the hospital where Helen died, the office building where I'd spent 40 years growing a business I no longer owned. Serafina drove with both hands on the wheel, focused on the road ahead. I watched Charlotte scroll past the passenger window and felt nothing. Not grief, not nostalgia, not even relief. Just the simple fact of departure. We arrived at the terminal at 5:47. Serafina parked short-term and insisted on walking me to the gate, even though I told her she didn't need to. Security was light at this hour, a few business travelers, an elderly couple heading somewhere warm. The TSA agent barely glanced at my ID before waving me through. Gate B7 was nearly empty when we arrived at 6:10. The departure board showed Delta Flight 1247 to Portland, on-time boarding at 6:35. Serafina checked the luggage tag on my carry-on twice, making sure it wouldn't get gate-checked, making sure I had everything I needed. I held the boarding pass in my hand, seat 12, a window. Destination, Portland, connecting flight to the small regional airport near Cannon Beach. The place Helen had circled in travel magazines for 20 years, the promise we'd made and broken every summer, because there was always another quarter to close, another deal to finalize, another reason to delay. "Mom would have loved this," Serafina said quietly, looking at the boarding pass. "The ocean, the rocks, all of it." She picked the place. "I'm just finally listening." Serafina looked at me like Helen used to, proud, sad understanding all at once. And I realized I'd spent 20 years avoiding that look because it asked me to be better than I was. Asked me to value what mattered instead of what paid. Asked me to notice the people who worked 12-hour days at minimum wage while my son spent thousands on country club dues he never questioned. Helen had known all along. She'd circled Cannon Beach in those magazines not because it was beautiful, but because it was away. Away from the business, the obligations, the life we'd built that had somehow stopped, including the things we'd promised each other at the beginning. Now I was going without her, but I was going. That had to count for something. We sat in the gate area seats, watching the sky lighten through the terminal windows. Pink and orange bleeding into dark blue, the sun not yet visible but coming. A few more passengers arrived, a young couple with backpacks, a businessman already on his phone, a woman traveling alone. At 6:25, the gate agent made the pre-boarding announcement. Passengers needing assistance, families with small children, anyone requiring extra time. Serafina turned to me, voice soft. "Do you want to call Kieran before you go, Dad?" I looked out the window at the tarmac, the planes lined up like patient birds, the sky growing lighter. I thought about my phone in my pocket, Kieran's number stored there for 42 years. I thought about the warehouse where he was probably waking up right now, setting his alarm, preparing for another 9-hour shift, lifting boxes. I shook my head gently. "Your brother has my number." Serafina studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "That's fair." Kieran's number sat in my phone like a door I'd locked from the inside. He could knock, but I'd already walked into a different room. A room with ocean views and weathered shingles, with Helen's travel magazines finally honored with 6 months of rental agreement, and whatever came after. He could join me there if he chose. The door wasn't locked from his side, but I wasn't waiting to see if he'd try the handle. At 6:35, the gate agent announced boarding for rows 15 through 30. My row. I stood, and Serafina stood with me. We faced each other in the fluorescent terminal light, and I saw Helen in her eyes, in the set of her jaw, in the way she was trying not to cry. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "I love you too. Take care of your foundation work." We hugged, and I felt her hold on, a beat longer than necessary, memorizing the moment. Then she let go. I picked up my carry-on, slung it over my shoulder, and walked to the gate. The agent scanned my boarding pass. The machine beeped approval. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Langley." I stepped into the jetway without looking back. Behind me, Serafina stood at the gate. Behind her, Charlotte, Kieran, Priscilla. The mansion, the country club, the life I'd dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but consequences and a scholarship fund in Helen's name. I buckled the seatbelt in seat 12A and watched the flight attendant demonstrate oxygen masks I hoped never to need. The cabin was filling with the ordinary sounds of departure, overhead bins clicking shut, passengers settling into seats. A toddler somewhere behind me asking questions, her mother answered in patient whispers. I'd stowed my carry-on above everything I owned in the world, fitting into a single bag that weighed less than the briefcase I'd carried to the office for 40 years. A businessman in the aisle seat opened his laptop before we'd even pushed back from the gate. The middle seat stayed empty, small mercy on a morning flight. I pressed my palm against the window and felt the cold glass, the world outside still dark, but lightening, the terminal lights reflecting off the wet tarmac. The flight attendant's voice came through the PA system, professional and practiced. "Welcome to Flight 1247 to Portland. We'll be in the air shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are in airplane mode. Helen's in my pocket. That's enough. I don't need to see her face to know she's with me." The plane pushed back from gate B7 at 6:48. The engines spooled up, that deep mechanical whine that makes everything feel inevitable. We taxied past other planes waiting their turn, past ground crew in orange vests, past the terminal where Serafina was probably still standing at the window, watching my plane pull away. At 6:52, the engines roared and we accelerated down the runway. The wheels lifted and Charlotte dropped away beneath us. I watched the city shrink through the window. Buildings became blocks, roads became lines. Neighborhoods became patterns of light and shadow. Somewhere in that grid of streets was the mansion on Woodland Drive. Empty, now waiting for the bank to sell it to strangers who wouldn't know. Helen had died in the master bedroom, or that Kieran had grown up believing he was entitled to every square foot. How many fathers spend 20 years building wealth to prove love only to discover that taking it all away was the first honest conversation they ever had? I didn't know if Kieran would ever understand what I'd done or why. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. I closed my eyes and let my head rest against the seat back. For 20 years, I'd carried Helen's memory like a weight I couldn't put down. Built wealth to prove I could provide what she'd deserved, accumulated assets to show I was worthy of the life she'd given me, watched Kieran take it all for granted because I'd never taught him what any of it cost. Not in dollars, in years, in choices, in the promises Helen and I made to each other that got buried under quarterly reports and board meetings. For 20 years, I waited, carried the burden, and hoped. I was invisible not to them, but to myself. Invisible under the Christmas lights that December night when Kieran told me to find somewhere else to sleep. Invisible in my own house, in my own life, in the space where I should have mattered most. Not because Kieran couldn't see me, but because I'd stopped seeing myself, stopped asking what I wanted, what Helen would have wanted, what actually mattered when you stripped away the money and the mansion and the pretense. Grief had been the mansion I lived in. Helen's death, the foundation, Kieran's entitlement. The walls, Priscilla's betrayal. The roof, and I'd finally walked out the door, leaving only the keys behind. Sometimes letting go isn't giving up. It's the only way for both sides to have a chance to start over. I didn't know what Kieran would do with his chance. Whether he'd learn to value what he'd lost or just resent me for taking it. Whether he'd build something real from his warehouse job and efficiency apartment, or spend the rest of his life bitter about the inheritance that disappeared. That was his story to write now, not mine. Mine was written in Helen's handwriting, in a travel magazine from 2006, Cannon Beach, Oregon. Retire here. Promise. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The plane cut through winter clouds, sunlight breaking through in shafts that turned the white cotton gold. Below, Charlotte had disappeared into the morning haze, the city just a smudge on the horizon, everything I'd built and dismantled, reduced to a point on a map that was already behind me. No Christmas lights overhead. No mansion weighing me down. No son to rescue from himself, no daughter-in-law to confront, no revenge left to orchestrate. Just clouds and horizon, and the promise Helen had made me write down 20 years ago in the margin of a magazine I'd thought we'd have decades to fulfill. I'd been wrong for decades, but I still had this. The flight attendant came through the cabin with coffee, and I declined. I didn't need anything. I didn't want anything except what I already had: a window seat, a carry-on bag, and 6 months in a cottage with ocean views where Helen had circled her dream in purple ink. Somewhere over the Appalachians, with the last of Charlotte's geography dissolving beneath a ceiling of winter cloud. I reached into my jacket pocket and drew out the photograph, Helen at Sequoia, 43 years old, laughing at something the camera couldn't capture, and held it against the cold glass of the window. So the pale morning light fell across her face the way afternoon sun once fell across our garden, warm and unhurried. The way time moves when you've finally stopped counting what you've lost and started noticing what remains. I didn't know if Kieran would ever dial those 11 digits. Didn't know whether the man lifting boxes in a warehouse on the east side of Charlotte would eventually trade his silence for something honest enough to matter. But somewhere between the altitude and the steady drone of engines and Helen's eyes catching the light at 32,000 feet, I understood that I had already answered the only question that ever truly belonged to me. Not whether my son would choose to grow, not whether Priscilla's careful escape had led her anywhere worth arriving, but whether Otis Langley at 68 years old, with a borrowed horizon and a one-way ticket, could finally learn to live a life that felt like his own, and the answer rising quiet and certain as the Pacific dawn already waiting on the far edge of the continent was yes. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Sometimes the hardest lessons we teach are the ones we wish we'd taught decades earlier. I spent 42 years believing that loving my son meant giving him everything. I was wrong. Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse comfort with preparation. I should have taught Kieran that respect is earned, not inherited, that wealth comes from work. By the time I understood, I had to take everything away just to give him a chance to learn what I should have shown him from the start. This family story taught me something: you can't rescue someone from consequences they need to face. Whether you're a parent or grandparent sharing grandpa stories with your own family, understand this: enabling isn't love. Real love sets boundaries. I believe God gave me just enough time to correct my mistake. Not enough to see if Kieran learned, but enough to stop repeating the pattern. This family story isn't just mine, it's a warning. These grandpa stories we share matter because they show what happens when we wait too long to do what's right. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a hard choice with family? What would you have done differently? If this family story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this one, subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. I appreciate you listening to my journey. One final note: while this story contains fictionalized elements for emphasis and reflection, the core message about consequences, boundaries, and choosing what matters most, that's real. That's what I hope you carry with you.